Good morning, beautiful viewer. You're looking very nice today, I must say. You know, people sometimes ask me why I don't trust the historians. They're educated, trained, credentialed. If there was anything important to find about Joseph Smith's polygamy, they would have already found it. Of course, there are myriad examples demonstrating that trusting historians is extremely stupid. I could just show that a PhD historian teaching a university history class is requiring his students to denigrate J.R.R. Tolkien and his work. That should end the argument for any person of culture. But perhaps some of my viewers haven't read The Lord of the Rings. Well, I found many things in LDS history that have been either unnoticed, ignored, or intentionally obscured by historians. But regardless, surely any thinking person would rebel at the prospect of turning off their mental faculties at the word of an alleged expert. Wasn't it only a few years ago that we were all told to shut up and listen to the experts, who turned out to be completely wrong about everything? It's no different in the field of history, which, unless one is studying an ancient or esoteric language or archaeology, the main advantage the historian has over an intelligent amateur is that the historian is paid to study history and tell the stories they find, while the amateur must do it on his own time. But this comes with drawbacks, for the historian will be beholden to whoever is writing the checks. And so the story, whether true or not, will be determined by the bias of the historian, or the people paying his or her bills. The same episode in history can generate wildly different results based on the bias of the storyteller. The historian. For instance, ask a Korean historian and a Japanese historian about the Japanese occupation of Korea. Facts that do not support the story are not included and not even searched for, and the interpretation of the agreed upon facts differs wildly. But that's no problem for the narrative each one is supporting, because, as I've mentioned before, as long as there are enough footnotes, the historian creates an air of respectability, and it's unlikely that people will even check the sources. This brings us to the subject of today's video, the LDS historian Andrew Ehat and the Journal of Joseph Fielding. Not Joseph Fielding Smith, Joseph Fielding. I mentioned in a previous video how Ehat projected his own ideas about polygamy onto Hiram Smith, going beyond ahistoricity to make actively anti-historical claims. Much could be said about Ehat's historical propaganda, but being one of those people who are not paid to tell stories, I can hardly be exhaustive. Therefore, in this video, I will only highlight a few more issues that call into question both Ehat and the journal. First, let's go to Ehat's master's thesis. This is definitely when you would expect the senior historians to be carefully scrutinizing Ehat's work before allowing a new initiate into their ranks. But notwithstanding almost 300 pages and over 700 footnotes, the text is littered with unsubstantiated claims that reflect not history, but Ehat's own bias, principally the dubious assertion that Joseph Smith was the one who originated LDS polygamy. And Ehat is not above straining the truth to force his point. The most egregious example that I've found, it's a long manuscript, is a quote that Ehat frames as Joseph Fielding summarizing the challenges of apostates, the laws, etc., and Fielding's thoughts on the matter. Ehat claims that Fielding wrote in his journal that the apostates object to the doctrine of a plurality of wives and of gods. Their principal charge against Joseph is that he has and seeks to obtain other women or wives and has taught the same to others who have done the same. I often preach to my wife and endeavor to inspire her with faith. Her mind has been troubled at the subject of spiritual wives. But I see nothing in all that is going on that troubles me at all. But the way in which subjects for the celestial kingdom is selected is not understood, etc., etc. You can read that on your own time. Certainly sounds like Fielding is testifying that he knew Joseph taught polygamy, doesn't it? Sounds like Fielding tried to convince his wife that polygamy was right and that he saw nothing wrong with it, doesn't it? The only problem is that Fielding didn't say that. Or rather, he wrote the words, but they come from 6 different pages of the journal, written on different days. Ellipses are usually used to cut a few extraneous words from a quote. However, all but 2 of Ehat's ellipses cut out pages of material, pages that Ehat doesn't even keep in order, by the way, to manufacture his quote. And why, you might ask, did Ehat insert material from 3 pages farther on in the journal in between his material from pages 27 and 28. It's quite simply so that Ehat can take Fielding out of context. Fielding's words about preaching to his wife, but him seeing nothing going on that troubled him, are made to sound like he's referring to polygamy. But though he does mention spiritual wives briefly, a phrase that Ehat includes with a flourish, it's only a small part of a list, the largest of which involves not Joseph Smith, but Apostle Lyman White. To quote the full journal, what troubled Mrs. Fielding was the subject of spiritual wives so much talked at this time, and other things, an expression of Elder Lyman White's, that if a woman complained of being insulted by any man, she ought to be set down as a strumpet, on the ground that no man would do it unless she gave him some liberty. This is what we call today victim blaming. And Fielding goes on for 2 more pages about the subject and how uncomfortable it made Mrs. Fielding. By removing that context, Ehat makes it appear that Fielding is writing about Joseph Smith being a polygamist, when Fielding was in truth writing about Lyman White insulting women. Ehat manufactured his quote, removing context to deceive the unwary reader into accepting his conclusions. This deliberately deceitful scholarship would not be tolerated in a high school English class, at least not in my day. But here we see it flying under the radar in a university master's thesis. We can only assume that whoever reviewed Ehat's work did not check his sources, possibly because the constructed quote already fit in with the bias of the reviewer. If you already believe something is true, why bother making sure that it is? But we should note that Ehat is not alone in this. Fielding himself records things out of order. Indeed, for the first part of the journal, Fielding seems to be rambling about whatever stories he can recall from a few years before he started writing. For example, on page 16, he recounts how his son was born on 20 July 1843. Then on the next page, he starts telling a random story about Joseph Smith that started in the spring of 1843. On page 27, he refers to himself being present at the excommunication of William Law, which happened on 18 April. Then on page 28, he gives the date of a new entry as 6 April. And on the next page, Fielding writes about things that happen in May, although no new entry was started. Now, Ehat is not unaware of this fact. In a footnote to his transcription of the journal, he gives reasons why he believes the material between pages 23 and 36 was written on 12 June 1844. However, he doesn't acknowledge the problem that Fielding was recording things out of order months or even years after they transpired. On page 57, while musing about people leaving the church after Joseph's death, Fielding uses language similar to what is later found in the LDS Church's polygamy revelation, Doctrine and Covenants 132. Fielding says, "How true that strait is the gate, and narrow is the way that leadeth unto the exaltation, and the eternal duration of lives, and few there be that go in thereat." In his transcribed version, Ehat claims in a footnote that the use of the words exaltation and lives in this passage suggests that Hiram Smith may have allowed his twice-over brother-in-law, Joseph Fielding, to read the manuscript of the Revelation on celestial marriage, including a plurality of wives. Indeed, that's one possible interpretation. But then, without analysis, Ehat treats the inference as a fact. This important contemporary corroboration of D&C 132 is one of many such allusions which support the conclusion that the revelation was received by Joseph Smith rather than Brigham Young. Well, when you start with your conclusion, it's never difficult to find evidence for it. But by now I'm sure you're not surprised to learn that Ehat overlooks several key facts. First, in order for Ehat's theory to be true, Hiram would have had to show Fielding the alleged polygamy revelation almost a year prior to him writing this entry in his journal, in that short period of only 1 or 2 days between Joseph allegedly having William Clayton write it down and Emma allegedly burning it. And that's assuming that the journal dating is accurate, which, as we've seen, is by no means certain. If Fielding knew about this for almost a year, why did he not mention Hiram showing it to him? Why did he not use this language when talking about the rumors of polygamy in the church? As you'll recall, Ehat had to splice disparate pages together to make it seem that Fielding was talking approvingly about polygamy. Not that the absence of the language earlier proves that he didn't see it, but the presence of it later proves far less than Ehat claims. Remember that Fielding recorded this after Joseph's death, a theory that's at least as likely, and I would say far more likely, is that after Joseph's death, certain individuals began sharing their polygamy doctrines more openly, and without Joseph and Hiram constantly preaching that polygamy was an abomination, they were able to make much more progress, including with Fielding. But there's an additional problem that Ehat was too blinded by bias to see. Fielding wrote a few pages earlier, when musing about Joseph's martyrdom, "I allude in particular to the doctrine of women being sealed to men for eternity. It seems that several have had women sealed to them, and it appears in general to have given great offense to the wife." I'm sure that it's not lost on you that Fielding's use of "it seems" and "it appears" indicates that he is just finding out now, after Joseph is dead, that several men in the church have multiple wives. Fielding could hardly have heard about plural marriage from Hiram last year and just be finding out about it now. There are other issues with Fielding's journal and Ehat's work on it, such as on pages 45 and 46, where Fielding is allegedly writing just after the deaths of Joseph and Hiram in June 1844, but gives details from the mythical Daniel's account that would not be published until May 1845. Ehat doesn't even seem to notice this discrepancy. There's also Fielding's account of how people are responding to the 12 openly teaching polygamy after Joseph's death. The Book of Mormon is quoted in opposition to this doctrine, where it is said that a man should have but one wife and no concubines. In a footnote, Ehat glosses over this obvious contradiction with the assertion that apparently this was a proof text used by William Law against Joseph Smith and the institution of plural marriage. Ehat apparently didn't know, or perhaps didn't want his readers to know, that far from anti-Mormons taking the scripture out of context, Hiram Smith quoted this scripture in one of his sermons denouncing polygamy. He said, "A man might have one wife, concubines he should have none." Observe that the idea was that this was given to Jacob for a perpetual principle. We come back to the question from the beginning. Why don't I trust the historians? The answer is because they are not trustworthy. They are paid to advance a specific position, and so, as we have seen with Ehat, evidence gets twisted, misused, or ignored in order to fit the story. I should add that this doesn't necessarily imply any malice on the part of Ehat or other historians. Ignoring information that doesn't fit your worldview is a normal human behavior, typically not performed consciously. This is why you shouldn't trust the historians or any experts to do your thinking for you. I hope that we, dear viewer, can be better than that, or at least that we can try to be. Thank you very much for watching. This is I Believe Joseph, and I will see you next time.